We now present For the Record.
Welcome to For the Record. I'm Will Keneally. This week proved to be a busy one as the state legislature returned to work on the state budget. Now, we will have a full breakdown of where everything stands in just a moment. But we start this week in Washington, where federal lawmakers are also working quickly to pass a federal spending bill before the July 4th holiday. Now, the future of this bill continued to appear shaky heading into this weekend as a few key Republican senators expressed reservations on whether they would vote for the final bill. And this week, Wisconsin Senator Tammy Baldwin spoke out against the bill, saying that it would cut Medicaid, food stamps, and rural health care funding for Wisconsinites.
Senate Republicans are jamming this bill through come hell or high water. I anticipate that they'll be bringing this downright dangerous bill to the Senate floor sometime in the coming days.
But the bill has been a point of contention among Republicans as well. One of the initial holdouts of the bill was Wisconsin's other senator, Ron Johnson. Now, he spoke with reporters on Thursday, expressing concerns about adding to the deficit.
I really don't want to fund the deep state, but I also don't want to have these massive deficits. So I'm very open. I'm very flexible. I'm focused about we have to stop mortgaging kids' future. It's unconscionable. It's wrong what we're doing. And again, I know the president shares that same goal.
Also in D.C. this week, the U.S. Supreme Court issued a ruling related to the Trump administration's push to end birthright citizenship. Right now, under the U.S. Constitution, anyone physically born in the U.S. is granted citizenship. Now, the court did not rule on whether that is constitutional or not, but instead wrote that a lower court's decision to block the Trump administration would not be binding across the entire country in most cases. Now, we'll get a further breakdown of this coming up later in the show. We also saw the state Supreme Court issue a handful of surprising rulings this week. The court rejected a push to redraw the state's congressional district maps, which could have seen more Democrats represent Wisconsin in Congress. The court also pushed back on how Governor Evers used his partial veto pen, as well as denied a push by UW nurses to unionize under a law that governs private sector unions. Now, again, we'll break all of this down with constitutional expert Howard Schwaber coming up later. And back in the Capitol, Wisconsin lawmakers approved a slate of bills that would explore the possibility of nuclear energy in Wisconsin. Among the bills headed to Governor Evers' desk is one that would require Wisconsin's Public Service Commission to look into where a nuclear plant would be viable in Wisconsin. Now, the governor had previously proposed $1 million for a similar study. And the state's flagship public university this week announced that it would be making broad 5% cuts for its budget starting in July. UW-Madison Chancellor Jennifer Mnookin wrote in a statement to the university that uncertainty about federal dollars coming in contributed to part of the cuts. Now, this will be paired with a 7% cut in administrative costs at the university, and Mnookin said that she expects much of the cost cutting can be done without layoffs. Now, this comes as the Universities of Wisconsin system budget is currently being debated in the state capitol, and lawmakers on the legislature's powerful budget writing committee worked late into the night on Friday to move ahead on the state budget. A hearing that was supposed to start at 10 in the morning was pushed back 12 hours as lawmakers could not come to agreement on the budgets for the university's system, the Departments of Transportation, Health Services, and Children's and Families. But the committee did move ahead on funding for things like tourism in Wisconsin and the agency that runs state elections.
All right, the hour of 10 a.m. and 10 p.m. haven't arrived. I'm going to call the Joint Finance Committee to order. We are here to continue our work on the state budget. We'll be taking up the following agencies: Wisconsin Elections Commission, Department of Administration. All other agencies that were noticed for today will be taken up at a later date.
We've talked an awful. I'll be brief, I promise. But we've talked an awful lot this finance session about various Republican ideas that have come to fruition and may or may not have been abandoned along the way.
And for more on where the budget process goes from here, we turn to our political analyst, Brandon Schulz. And I first want to start with what we saw late Friday night into the wee hours of Saturday morning here.
Oh, even before we got to Friday night when Joint Finance finally came in, they were supposed to come in at 10 o'clock in the morning, and then 11, and then 12, and then 1, and then 2, and then the press conferences. And by the time everything came together, it was 10 o'clock. Press conference was canceled, and it was 10 o'clock, which meant what was really going on behind the scenes was Republicans and Democrats were trying to negotiate on the big package of things they wanted to take care of yesterday. And, you know, credit to the legislature and all those involved in the discussions, rather than just turning on their heel and walking out and saying, we're going to vote what we want. They really did take a lot of time to see where they could come to some agreement. And when Joint Finance convened yesterday, we saw a number of motions where, yes, the Democrats offered an alternative, It didn't pass, but then you saw a lot of those things on 16-0 votes. So for budget watchers, that means a 16-0 vote meant all the Republicans and all the Democrats voted on that particular issue. So I think that's a good sign. Maybe it's frustrating for a lot of people who are watching the budget and wanting some things happen yesterday. But there was progress yesterday, and it was because they sat down and met. And so I think kudos to Republicans and Democrats in the legislature for getting to that point.
So it seems like a lot of the focus here is on the Republican infighting, but this is everybody sitting down at the table, you're saying?
Yeah, we know that Senate Republicans have an issue with two of their members drawing some lines in the sand and saying they just simply won't vote. So you have to deal with that. You have to recognize their issues. And if you're not able to meet where they want to be, then Republicans will have to go find some Democrat votes to pass the bill in the Senate once it clears joint finance. So again, lots of negotiations, lots of give and take. We know back from when Republicans and the governor were meeting that the issues on the table were education, health care, the UW. So those sorts of things are likely, we would suspect, in those discussions. And again, we did see some compromise motions yesterday, so that was likely part of it as well. In the same respect, there was a lot left on the table. There were things for a lot of the agencies that they dealt with that they didn't take up. So that may mean it may come in more compromise discussions, or they've moved on.
Why this rush to go so late on a Friday night, but then end up punting on agencies like the UW system?
Well, I think the intent was to go yesterday. It was to go Friday and get as much done as they can. But look, they're in deep negotiations. They're trying to find a way to either match up what the Democrats want, what Republicans want. So as much as everybody wanted them to come to the table on Friday, the priority was trying to see where they could find common ground. So I think that's good. But yeah, it was a little frustrating that if you're waiting around all day, it didn't come. And also, I think there's, when you talk about a rush and the urgency, it's been since February. So they do sit with a June 30 deadline. It's not a do or die deadline here in Wisconsin like it is in Washington, because we just continue on. But I think there is a sense that they want to get as much done by July 4th, because once the Joint Finance Committee agrees on a budget, then it has to be rewritten so that both the Assembly and the Senate can take it up, and you got to give each house a couple of days. So, just like they said in Washington the other day, maybe they'll have to go past July 4th to get that bill. Well, maybe we'll have to go past July 4th in Wisconsin to get our budget. That's not necessarily a bad thing.
Brandon Scholes, thank you. Now, when we come back, we break down the latest series of Supreme Court decisions, both at the federal and state levels, with constitutional expert Howard Schwaber. And later, we break down the latest results from the Marquette Law School poll with poll director Charles Franklin. We'll be right back after this. Welcome back to For the Record. Now, the early summer months are a busy time on the court docket. That's when the terms for both the state and federal Supreme Courts end, and many influential decisions get released. Now, that included this week a decision by the U.S. Supreme Court to block a lower court's ruling that prohibited the Trump administration from changing the meaning of birthright citizenship. And at the state level, the Wisconsin Supreme Court rejected a push to redraw the state's congressional district maps. Now, to break all of that down, we spoke with constitutional expert Howard Schwaber earlier this week. Yeah, so coming out this Friday was a decision by the state Supreme Court that impacts UW nurses. Now, it ruled that a law that applies to private sector unions does not impact these UW nurses. They can't collectively bargain under that private sector law. Now, the interesting thing for me is that it was a unanimous decision, right?
If you think of this as a policy question and sort of what kinds of outcomes do we expect people to favor, then we would be surprised by 7-0 outcome, because we would think, gosh, the 4 liberal justices, we would think, right, might be in favor of rolling back Act 10 as much as possible and allowing institutions to do that and so on. The justices were focusing on the underlying question, which is where a statute is in place, and Act 10 is a legitimate Wisconsin law. Some people would like to challenge its constitutionality, but at present it is good law. Where a law is in place, how much authority do state agencies have, for example, to carve out exceptions to that law? And the proposition that it sounds like the 7 justices agreed on is not much.
Now, certainly this decision implicates a separate area of law than Act 10, but it's hard not to kind of view this as a precursor case to Act 10. Can we take away anything from what the justices ruled in this decision to indicate whether they might uphold Act 10 at all?
No, I don't think it does, and that's what I'm saying. You could be, as a judge, deeply committed and deeply convinced that Act 10 is unconstitutional, but nonetheless strongly feel that while it is in effect, it would be wrong to allow, remembering that the University of Wisconsin is a state agency, to allow state agencies in particular to sort of find workarounds and carve-outs to prevent that law from applying to their people. There's no contradiction there. While the law is in place, it's perfectly consistent to say, I think this law is terrible. I'm likely to conclude when asked the question that it is unconstitutional, but nonetheless, while it's in place, everyone has to play by the rules.
All right, turning now to the congressional district maps, the justices ruled in a decision that they are not going to take up a challenge to those maps. Does this make that issue essentially dead heading into the 2026 midterms?
Yes, I think it's definitely dead before 2026. Okay, so this is sort of the opposite. The easiest explanation for this, the easiest explanation for this is politics, and not the usual kind of partisan politics within the court that we talk about. Is there a conservative majority? Is there a liberal majority? But rather a concern on the part of the court of not overreaching. There is a concern, and a legitimate concern, that every time there's a judicial election in Wisconsin, the majority of the court shifts its ideology, and then everything is in play. You know, I read the unanimity of these decisions as the liberal majority saying, we've done some things, we've taken some steps as is appropriate, but we're going to be cautious about stepping into particularly national politics in this way. Those are the plausible explanations for the decision. It is difficult to see a purely legal reason why the principles announced in the state districting cases should not also apply in congressional districting cases.
And turning briefly to that U.S. Supreme Court decision on birthright citizenship, can you help kind of parse that ruling for us and how that might impact birthright citizenship in the country?
This is massively, this is massively complicated. The shortest possible version goes like this. So the United States Supreme Court has not ruled on the question of birthright citizenship. What they have ruled is that while that issue is pending, lower courts may not issue injunctions that bind the federal government as a whole and therefore apply to the whole country. What this means is both broader and narrower than the case about birthright citizenship. It's narrower in the sense that the fundamental constitutional question is not resolved. It's broader in that it applies to all cases. So we have seen over and over and over in the last couple of months fights between the Trump administration and federal courts, where the federal court issues an order, the Trump administration does not fully comply with that order, or challenges it, or appeals it. There are then questions of whether the order will be stayed while the appeal is going forward. Right? Those are the sort of procedural fights we've been seeing for the last couple of months. The Supreme Court just wiped an enormous amount of that off the table. Let us be clear of what we're talking about. If the executive order remains in place, pending being eventually ruled unconstitutional, in that intervening period before the Supreme Court rules that the law is unconstitutional, children born in America can be deported. That is what the Trump administration is seeking to do. And the decision of the Supreme Court has created a situation, the dissenters pointed this out in strong terms, that for a very long, that underlying case may not be decided until next year. And so in the intervening period of time, DHS maybe will be free to go around and deport any American-born child of undocumented parents. To put it very, very bluntly, for that period of time while we wait, as we've learned, we sometimes have to wait a long time for the federal courts to work out constitutional questions. The U.S. government is free to violate people's constitutional rights pretty much at will.
When we come back, Marquette poll director Charles Franklin breaks down his latest numbers, which look into whether Wisconsin voters want to see a third Evers term. We'll be right back after this. Welcome back to For the Record. This week, the Marquette Law School released one of the few polls that we'll see from them this year, with insight into the current budget negotiations at the state capitol and a look at whether Wisconsin voters want Governor Evers to run for a third term. We sat down with poll director Charles Franklin Here's more. So I want to start with your poll. You're looking at some of the biggest topics that we're looking at in the state capitol right now, especially the state budget. It's really interesting to take people's temperature on that. I want to start with this idea of UW funding, which seems to be kind of the lightning rod of politicians, at least right now, trying to pass the state budget. Your poll shows pretty broad support for universities. Can you describe that a little bit?
Yeah, we asked, and to be clear, we asked about the universities of Wisconsin, not UW-Madison alone, so the whole system. 27% say the budget for the universities should be increased, but 49% say kept the same. 23% say it should be reduced. So that's sort of even on raise or reduce, with nearly half in the middle saying the budget's sort of where it is. We followed that up with a second question that included the information that Wisconsin ranks 44th out of 50 states in state support for four-year colleges. And we also mentioned that the system has closed several two-year campuses in recent years. Then asked, do you think the university system simply has to live within its current funding amounts, or should they get a budget increase? And with that question, 41% say a budget increase, but still 57% say live within their means. So I think my read of this is there's pretty strong support for keeping the budget level flat rather than a cut. But there's only a limited amount of support for an increase. Also in February, we'd asked about the university's request for an $800 million increase, and we saw a majority opposed to that in February.
We saw support for either keeping flat or increasing university funding for people that didn't receive a college education. So this seems to kind of impact those people as well.
That's right. There's not an enormous gap between non-college graduates and college graduates. College graduates are a little more supportive. But even among college graduates, it's a limited amount of support for budget increases. It's still well below 50% among college grads.
Interesting, too, that we might see Republicans in the state capitol consider cuts. And again, we're recording this before Joint Finance has taken some votes on this on Friday. What do we make of this idea that Republicans may not necessarily be emblematic of what the people are looking for here?
Yeah, I think that there's not any evidence in our polling that people are against the universities. It's more that they feel like we're spending a lot of money, we don't want to give big increases beyond that. I think also if you look 2 years ago when there was a struggle over the university's budget as well, initially some cuts and then some modest increases that were eventually done. This is also a struggle between legislative influence and control of the universities and the university's independence in those things, with the governor favoring some increases for the universities. But that struggle, as we know, has been at sort of a deadlock for 6 years now.
The other thing that we're kind of watching in the state capitol is once the budget gets passed and signed, that's been kind of the landmark where Governor Evers has said he'll make a decision on whether to run again or not. And you polled on that question. What do we know so far?
Yeah, 42% say they'd like him to run. 55% say they'd like him not to run. So that's a little worse than his job approval numbers, because he's at 48 approved, 46 disapproved, a net positive on approval, but this negative balance on running again. It's important to point out that we asked exactly the same question about Scott Walker in January of 2016, and at that point 61% didn't want Walker to run again. And so Evers is in a little better shape than where Walker was. And of course, Walker went on to run and to lose to Evers narrowly. So I don't expect that this is the key to any decision the governor's going to make. And it's important to say 83% of Democrats say they want him to run, just 15% don't. And there's not much age effect there. 28% of people under 30 say they don't want him to run. But it's in the low teens for all other age groups not wanting him to run. So compared to Biden, where there was a pretty strong age difference in him running again, The age difference is pretty modest, though for those under 30, a little bit more reluctance to see him seek a third term.
So you'd be cautious to kind of extrapolate what we saw from Biden in 2024 compared to what we'll see with Evers in 2026?
Yeah, I think that's right. At the moment, Evers is certainly a more active and governor. The kinds of concerns that were raised about Biden for several years, I don't think I've seen credibly raised about Evers. But this is a moment, especially in the Democratic Party, where we see younger people entering politics, winning some elections. We certainly see a discussion within the party about the transition from an older established leadership to a new wave of younger people. And Evers is caught up in part of that no matter what.
Our conversation there with Marquette Poll Director Charles Franklin. When we come back, a look ahead to next week. We'll be right back after this. Welcome back to For the Record. A look ahead to next week, we can likely expect lawmakers to continue working quickly to pass the state budget before we get too far into summer. But as we are recording this, we're not seeing any meetings scheduled on the calendar just yet. Now, a reminder that you can watch full episodes of the show as well as expanded interviews on our website at channel3000.com. That does it for us this week. I'm Will Keneally. Have a great rest of your weekend.
This has been For the Record.